Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this rapid fire live edition of TPA Talks. I'm not in TPA headquarters today, I'm at home, but that's not stopped me being engrossed by watching the Chancellor deliver his spending review today. Of course, it was for a spending review just over 1 year, when normally spending reviews are over a 3-year pipeline. So all eyes are on the Chancellor today, and we know what extensive damage COVID has done to the public finances. Indeed, the cost of coronavirus is now estimated after today's forecast to be £280 billion, which is up 88 billion from just July's estimate, so only a few months ago. So we know what damage COVID has done to the public finances. But what about the rest of spending? What about what it means for our long-term borrowing? What about what it means for our deficit, and what it might mean in the future for our taxes, indeed? So I'm really pleased to be joined by the TPA chairman, Mike Denham, this afternoon. Mike, in a former life, was actually an economist at the Treasury. So might give us some interesting insights into exactly what today's figures mean, and indeed what they mean for spending now, and possibly what it means for the economic big picture going into the future. So Mike, if you want to just kick us off and give us your view on today's spending review.
Thanks, John. Well, we were warned that the forecasts were going to be sobering, and sobering they were. I mean, I'm old enough to remember several previous chancellors wrestling with very difficult economic and fiscal circumstances. George Osborne, of course, in 2010, going back to the early 80s, the Geoffrey Howe budget, the notorious budget where he had to grip the fiscal situation very strongly. And before that, in the 70s, Dennis Healey. But I don't think any of them have had to deal with a situation quite as difficult as the one Rishi Sunak has faced. So I think we ought to begin by acknowledging that he has had a very difficult job to do, and he's had to take some decisions that perhaps in the longer term, in the calmer light of day, he would not have taken. But just turning to those numbers, as you say, the coronavirus cost, the spending programs have gone up to 280 billion. And of course, the weakness in the economy has meant that receipts have fallen now by well over 100 billion. So we're looking at borrowing of the order of 400 billion this year, getting on for 20% of GDP, which is unprecedented in peacetime. And you have to go right the way back to the Second World War, as he said, to come up with anything like that. I think that looking at it overall, we would say, although generally speaking, the Taxpayers Alliance is very strong on controlling public spending and keeping taxes down, reducing taxes to stimulate the economy, I think we'd have to say in the circumstances, we understand why he felt it necessary to spend so much shoring up the economy and jobs and incomes. So in a sense, we're not giving him a free pass on that. But we understand the situation, and it would be very difficult for him to have made other decisions. But looking at the longer term, he obviously focused on the 1-year horizon, as you say, because that is a 1-year spending plan. And he didn't really talk about how he was going to address the situation longer term. But looking at the OBR projections, and I think we should recognize that it is very difficult to forecast economies at the best of times, let alone in a situation like this, which is more or less unprecedented. But looking at the longer term situation, they're saying that even when we get out to the middle of the decade, the economy is going to be 3% smaller, pretty well on a permanent basis. This is their central scenario than it then was expected back in March at the time of the budget. And that borrowing by mid-decade is still going to be running at 100 billion a year, around 4% of GDP. And that is not a sustainable situation. I know there are people who say, well, interest rates are very low at the moment. The government can borrow at virtually no cost. And of course, with QE, they can borrow at sort of more or less zero cost. But, those low borrowing rates, we can't really take them for granted forever. And it's no good leaving it until we get a situation where, for example, the government suddenly finds that there's a guilt. Back in the old days, there used to be this thing called a gilt strike, where the investors just suddenly decided they did not want to buy British government bonds. And suddenly you're in a situation where interest rates and yields spike up and you've got a real problem. So we can't wait till we get a crisis situation. We have to do something to address it. And I think looking at the numbers, taxpayers should be very concerned, because all chancellors are tempted to close those gaps by increasing taxes. And we've already seen quite a lot of pressure on the current chancellor to do precisely that. People talking about needing tax increases of 40 billion per annum, maybe more. And that would be a terrible idea for two main reasons. First of all, of course, experience shows us over and over again that if you try and correct a fiscal deficit using big tax increases, you can whack the economy on the head. And particularly when the economy is in such a fragile position, the last thing we need is tax increases. If anything, we need tax cuts from here. Business and entrepreneur stimulating tax cuts, but we certainly don't need tax increases. And the second reason is this: it's all very well spending a lot of money, and we might come back to this in a moment. But this government has already increased spending back in March on quite a few items. There's further spending today, a lot of infrastructure spending that sounds very good on paper, but we've seen these infrastructure projects in the past and they haven't delivered always, and they very often overrun. So, spending's fine, but it has to be done efficiently. And as we've said at the TPA over and over again, the key thing is, what do we actually get out of this spending? And, I know, have recently put forward a number of ideas for getting more use out of the existing spending. We called it Save to Spend. And perhaps, John, I'll throw that back to you to say a few words about that.
Yeah, absolutely, Mike. We looked at several areas, one of which was addressed today by the Chancellor and overseas aid, which was a welcome saving. I think there's wiggle room within the 0.7% target to reduce aid spending in times of emergency. And if this isn't one, then I don't know what is. But of course, we're looking at some other big picture areas, such as scrapping or decentralizing, rather, pay bargaining, so that decisions on pay aren't made in Whitehall, they're made locally to reflect local pay conditions, which would be a better sustainable path for the economy. Then, of course, it's not just about making those big structural savings. There's also a cultural change that we feel could be made in Whitehall. We've had a program of investigating wasteful spending for many years now, and come to prominence in the last few days, especially in a joint project with the Daily Mail, where we've identified over £5 billion worth of wasteful spending. So I think the Chancellor today, as you said, Mike, he had extraordinary challenges, and I don't envy his job one bit. But at the same time, I think there's a couple of savings in there, aren't there, that of overseas aid and a public sector pay freeze, or at least partial. So once we look at those savings, perhaps we could start to hear more about the public finances for the longer term. How sustainable are they? I mean, we've heard about some big spending on some jobs program, and Mike, I know we were talking about this earlier, of course. Do you feel that sort of subsidizing jobs is the right thing to do at the minute, or are there other ways to help boost employment and growth?
Well, I think subsidizing jobs, again, it's one of these things that if you're sitting in number 11 and you're facing a huge surge in unemployment, as obviously Britain is facing at the moment, it's very tempting to think of ways in which you can actually keep jobs going or get people back into work by providing job subsidies. And I mean, one of the elements of the package today is very similar to the work programme that was announced by the Cameron-Osborne government back in 2010-11, which, sounded like a sensible idea. The idea was that you take the long-term unemployed, particularly people who find it difficult because they're older or they've never been in the labour market, and you help them back into work by essentially managing them back into work, giving some incentives to employers to take them on. And in that case, they used private contractors to help people back into work, and and gave bonuses to the private contractors for how many people actually stayed in work, how many people were still in work after 12 months, 24 months, and so on. And in principle, that sounded like a great idea, but actually the experience was very mixed. And the proportion of people who ended up getting transferred into a permanent job off of that program was relatively low. It was under 20% in my memory. Yeah. And there were a lot of areas where the system was abused and money was overspent. It was all very inefficient. a far more efficient way of creating jobs is to cut taxes on employers, cut regulation on employers, and allow the private sector to create the jobs. It may take a little longer, but those jobs are sustainable jobs that create wealth. And I think that's much more of the sort of thing that the government should be looking at.
Right. And we know, Mike, from the figures today that non-government employment in 21-22 will be 1 million lower than the March forecast. So jobs are crucial. And of course, the Chancellor rhetorically put it at the center of his spending review today. But of course, now looking forward, dare I say it, a couple of months to the budget, you're saying that we should be looking at ways to incentivize employers to create jobs sustainably into the long term without having taxpayers subsidize them.
Absolutely right, John. I mean, I don't think we should give Rishi Sunak too hard a time on this because, we know from his past writings and so on that he has got ideas about this. I mean, he's written extensively on the creation of free ports, for example, that we will be able to do once we're out. Once we are out of the EU. But that is something that can be done further, and a lot of that depends on tax breaks inside those areas. So I think he probably is thinking along the right lines. Perhaps we can help him not to get bounced into some of these other schemes that are around, which basically involve job subsidies funded by taxes on other jobs elsewhere.
Right, and I think the TPA can be relied upon to come up with good arguments of ways to save taxpayers money, and of course to fight for a lower, simpler tax system, crucially also to drive economic growth. Mike, listen, our bite-sized TPA Talks is about done, so I appreciate your time in joining us. We're both going to go away and continue to pore over the OBR's fiscal outlook as well as the Chancellor's spending review document. So thank you all for watching, and thank you again to Mike for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.